Nice. What do you got for a drink here?
I got the Big Sky DevCon mug just for this.
They had a mugs there.
Well, it was a speaker gift, which is like
Awesome.
one of the best gifts I've ever received.
Yeah,
Very
that's a
nice
good
camp
one.
mug.
That is a good one. Yeah, I was there at the Big Sky Dev Con, and
Did we meet?
no, I don't think so. I'm not a big meeting person. Um, no, I
Fair
didn't. I
enough.
didn't see you there. But I loved your talk there. That was really good.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that was one of the. It's funny. There was some stuff I wasn't really expecting there at Big Sky. Like I sort of came to learn more about HTMX. I've been getting into it and stuff like that, and sort of this bigger picture. I think your talk about what was it, the life and death of HTMX, I
Yep,
think it
that's
was
the one.
called. Yeah, so just this concept of like, if all goes well, HTMX will just slowly subsume into HTML and disappear, and we'll have all the power of what HTML could have been.
Right, right.
So I thought that
Could
was
still be.
interesting. Yeah,
I think there's a an attitude that happens sometimes with HTML where you're like, well, we should have done this thing 10 years ago and it didn't happen, so that's a bummer. But I think HTML is going to be around for a very long time, and that's the premise that informs both of the talks that I gave recently. And if you think of HTML as a very, very long lasting technology, then it's really not that big a deal that we didn't do something when we should have done it 10 years ago if HTML is a, say, 100-year technology. So I totally get the impulse because I feel that way too. And especially when you're an up and coming web developer, you're like, wait, why can't forms do put? There's just like, there's some very obvious things that are missing, but that doesn't mean that they can't ever be there. And that's part of how they structure the web platform.
yeah, yeah. And I remember you mentioning at one point, I think, just this idea of like the platonic ideal for what a minimal like representation of what you need is, like to do I think it was a post request or something like that, and you mentioned
Yeah,
HTMX as like that possibility, but like I mean I
it's
feel like
close.
that's why HTML has stuck around so much. It's like, what how much smaller can you get, or would you want to get, to have
Right.
like a visual hierarchical representation of data than like tags and stuff inside it and stuff like that. Like, it just makes a lot of sense. So I feel like, betting on it for the long term does make sense.
It's also very good at there's a couple things that make HTML, I think, a really durable technology. First of all, it's super cheap. If you think about like what it costs to get started with Swift development, and you have to learn like Swift UI, and you have to buy the Apple Developer Toolkit. I think I don't know. I'm not an Apple developer, but there's a lot of stuff involved in getting your compiled software project of any kind to somebody else's computer and distributed that way. And the web, the hard work has already been done for you. The getting all the software that needs to be on somebody else's computer is there, and all you have to do is structure a couple tags, and you have access to the computing power in a more limited paradigm, but nevertheless a sufficient paradigm to do lots of very, very powerful things like look up stuff on an encyclopedia or do online banking or whatnot. And those applications are what I'm interested in. I think that there's a lot that can happen in that space, and that in that space, the limitations benefit our ability to deliver good experiences there.
Yeah. So what, I guess, like, I've heard you talk a couple times about sort of the stuff that you envision for this, and I have my own kind of picture in my mind of what that is. But like, what are some services like you feel like should be part of that? You mentioned banking as a possibility, and I guess like I think you mentioned in one of your talks, a library system. Like, you want this to be around forever. There's no need for it to have any special fancy technology. Like, what else kind of do you feel like falls into that, or does everything, almost everything fall into that? Which is kind of where I'm a little bit at.
Yeah, it is almost everything. That's the honest answer. Anything that requires a network request to be fulfilled and to have some transaction take place. So is a paradigm that HTML is best at. So banking, good example. Another one, flights. I mean, why would you book a flight on the phone when the information density available to you on your screen and via the web browser is drastically more than any other way that that information could be presented to you and the flexibility of it. So um, just a lot of kind of daily bureaucratic tasks that have to get done are very good on the web. And that's not even including a lot of the things that are really fun about being online. Social media, if you think that's fun, games, there's a ton of like really exciting imaginative possibilities. But even if you don't consider any of the really any of the stuff that is sort of artistically or creatively satisfying, there's a lot of just tasks that we have to do that have now become internet connected tasks, and the vast majority of those tasks can be done well just on the web platform.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and this is kind of like, I struggle sometimes to tell people the sort of stuff that I work on because they're like, oh, I build websites. And it's like, well, that's okay.
I started
It's,
saying that too. That's my go-to. I make
yeah.
websites.
Yeah. It's like, there's, if I
And
try
they're
to get
like, can
into
you
it, it's
make
like,
mine? I'm like, no, not like that.
yeah, that's the thing. So I'm like, I don't know, you might need like a Wix thing or something, but like,
Yeah,
I'm like, I
that's what
guess
they
I
think you
build
do.
web apps. And it's like, the distinction is like, you need to be able to change the data and it needs to know who you are. Like, I don't like,
Yeah,
that's what I sort of think of. And like, the more
makes sense.
stuff that I work on, I'm like, this is most of the way, most of the things out there. I'm like, this is starting to fall under this
Right.
category.
Yeah, I've had that same realization, and I keep trying to push the limits of that paradigm, and I keep not hitting the limits of it. And the more you do that, the crazier you feel because you're like, wait, but everything I've worked on has needed like three different NPM workstations to build, and then I had to run a Docker container so that that could interface with the Redis, which made the Postgres database faster. And I'm starting up these five services just to get one web app to run. Those people have to know something that I don't because I'm not doing that anymore, and it doesn't matter. But I don't think I'm crazy. I do think that, and that's part of why I think there are a lot of people, especially in the HTMX community, who are frustrated that the obvious benefit of not doing all that junk hasn't like immediately changed the way that websites are built. And first of all, it has dramatically. I mean, for HTMX to be as successful and as much of a brand that you would start a podcast called HX Pod, it is far more success than basically every open source project will ever see. And two, again, if you take seriously the premise that the web is going to be around a very long time, then it doesn't matter that we did all this junk in the 2010s if we are able to develop sustainable, durable practices today.
Yeah. So let me just like, let me start off by saying, like, in this conversation, like, I am 100% sold. I watched your thing, and like, this is just like, sometimes in a podcast it's nice to have like a back and forth, or I'm arguing with you, we're kind of like but like, I watched the 100 year web service, I think you
Mm-hmm.
called it.
Yeah.
And it's like, and the talk at Big Sky, but that the 100 year web service particularly just like felt like a revelation, where it's
Oh,
like
thank you.
you're bringing together all these things that have kind of been like bouncing around in my head, and I think for a lot of people, like you said, SQLite's having a moment right now,
Definitely.
and
That's a big part of it.
yeah, and there's a reason for it. There is this like overarching complexity, and can I read you one of your own quotes here?
Please. Yeah. And that will be helpful for the listeners as well, because they may
Yeah.
not have seen the talks.
So the talk, I'll just like preface the talk a little bit, just from my perspective, is like the idea that you're building something, the 100 year web service. You're building something that's going to last forever. So immediately you have to toss aside the build process, because that's not
Hmm.
going to last for 2 years. So
No,
so
it
there's a
doesn't.
lot of stuff, and so you go through pretty systematically and talk about four different parts: the web, the database, the app logic, and any additional client stuff. So between those things, you can sort of bring them together. But let me read you this, like, a quote that, like, I had to pause and go back and just listen to it again. Um, the experience of refreshing the page or clicking on a quote hard link is identical to the experience of partially updating the page. And that's something that just quietly happened in the last 10 years with no fanfare. All of the people who wrote basically basic HTML got a huge performance upgrade in their browser. And everybody who tried to beat the browser now has to reckon with all the JavaScript they wrote to emulate these basic features. So that I just like that I feel like, the fact that it happened quietly and in the last 10 years, and if if you've been a developer like me for the last, like, I don't know, I don't want to say 20 years, but I was certainly there 10 years ago, and I've been through the
I was
cycle.
not, by the way.
Okay. So you're I'm feeling you're a
About
little younger
5
than
years
me.
I've been doing this.
Okay. So for those of us who have been around, like, I remember what it used to be like and why when SPAs first came out, I was drawn to them. And I wrote a lot of stuff, and I started with Ember and then Angular and eventually moved to Vue. And, I had my own awful SPA that I built. And it's just like, what a mistake on every level. But I remember why I did that. It's because nobody liked this kind of old school thing where you like hit post, you hit your like submit, and then like you wait and you don't know if your browser's broken
Yeah.
and you don't know what's going on, and you click a link and everything like moves around. And so it was like that was all there. And that's literally what people remember, that like people have that ingrained in their head who were developing 10 years ago. And
Can I
yeah.
challenge that for a second? Or just
Okay. Yeah.
ask a question? Because first of all, I used the web at that time. So I know exactly the kind of experience that as a web developer, you're like, this feels clunky. I don't want it to feel like a web page from 2005. I want it to feel fast and fluid. The part I want to kind of ask more about is you say you click a thing, it's a post form, you don't know if the browser is broken. And by the way, I very much remember when you click a form and then you like either click a refresh or a back button and it says, do you want to resubmit this data? And as a user, I'm like, I don't know. Why are you putting that on me? You should know what's happening here. I have no idea. Is it bad if I resubmit this data? So the part I want to ask about was the SPA that you built in the kind of failure case where the thing was submitted and the network didn't like fully respond, there's something bad happened, which always happens because networks are unreliable, even under the best of conditions. Did the failure case get better communicated to the user? And if
No,
so,
no, no,
how?
no.
Oh, okay. Well, there we
No, it's
go.
bad. It's all
Yeah.
bad. Like what I lost doing that, and I didn't know I was going to lose all these things when I started. I was like, okay, look, we need to make it faster, which means like we're going to have one JavaScript thing. It's going to handle like we
Yeah.
take it and we get HTML. I think of it now as like the whole thing was basically like an HX swap OOB system.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Where you just like the back end threw
Just
everything
says, it's
in.
going here and it goes
Exactly.
to the top of the page or the bottom of the page. Yeah.
Sounds great. All of a sudden, like none of my users could use their back button anymore. None of my users could refresh. Like none of my it was like I lost all these things that I had taken for granted. And by that point, it was too late. So, obviously that's been solved in some versions of SPAs.
Sort
but
of.
Sort of.
Has
That's,
it?
yeah, has it. No, and it's, I mean, honestly, it's still, even with HTMX and stuff like that, you still need to think about it. Like it's still,
Yes,
the
absolutely.
web 1.0, the multi-page app, like, man, that is solid. Like they did solve
It's
that,
really solid.
which was really nice.
Yeah.
And so I understand still trying to use that as much as possible.
One of my theories about user experience on the web is that, and through no fault of their own, but users don't have a really good grammar for describing what is or is not a good web app experience, and not developers even don't. So how on earth would users be able to do that? But and I talk about this in that piece you quoted, which is called "Who's Afraid of a Hard Page Load," and when I reflected on my own experiences as a web user before I had the grammar of being a web developer, I realized that the websites that I most enjoyed using, the websites I felt most comfortable on, and the websites I felt like I understood how the behavior happened, were ones that had fundamentally multi-page structures because they use this common grammar that browsers have taught us how to interact with a web page. So in that piece, I talk about I used to have an iPod Touch, which only had internet when you were connected to Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi felt like this really precious commodity. And what I would do is I would go to websites and I would load them, and then I would not navigate because I knew that as long as I didn't click anything on the page was loaded. It had gotten the thing and now it was on there. And I knew what kind of interactions with the browser would mess that up. And as in like the middle of the 2010s, when a lot of websites wanted to feel more modern, a lot of applications switched to a more single page app like architecture, I knew instinctively, even though I didn't name it, I knew which apps I had to baby. I knew which websites, if the internet cut out in any way, I was just screwed. That there would be no recovery. If I refreshed the page, the whole thing would break. Like I just knew instinctively what even visual cues in the way the app was created told me, the user, hey, be careful with this one because you're not going to be able to click the back button. You're not going to be able to click the refresh button. And if you pause midway, you have no idea what's going to get saved. So those,
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, absolutely. And this is one thing that, you weren't around for. So I don't know if you've got any of the context for this, but I also went through, and I'm not saying exactly that I think SPAs are going to go this direction, but I was there 3,000 years ago when Flash was
Oh yeah,
the
I was there for
thing.
Flash
Okay, you were there for Flash. Okay.
as a
Well,
user.
okay. So yeah,
Yeah,
so I was, at the time kind of just dipping my toe into building websites for people, but I was building them for artists and
interesting.
musicians.
Yeah.
And so you know, Flash was cool. Like you could do these cool things.
What were you
But
using, by the way? What was your like? How did you build the websites? What program? Because I remember there was
it
like a
was, yeah, Macromedia Flash. I mean,
right. Okay.
it had its own sort of
Right.
IDE and stuff like
Yeah, yeah,
that. But
yeah.
you
That's
would
what I
then
thought.
like, export an SWF, which you would just embed.
Yeah.
And then it could sort of interact with the stuff around it, but sort of not. So, um, it had some quirks, but it almost, there's something similar there where you're sort of building in the same way that an SPA, it's like using JavaScript to kind of just build. There was also these things called applets, where it was like just this little self-contained system that lived in your client, in your browser. And Flash was kind of like that. They tried to integrate it a little more,
Yeah.
but Flash came and went.
RuneScape was a Java applet for a while. The web game RuneScape. So anybody who would see like Java like look.
And games are great for stuff like that. Like,
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think they're a self-contained thing like that. But
Why
like, I
not?
do think there's a reason Flash isn't around anymore. And I think part of it is like what you can do with HTML. And like,
Yeah,
that's the stuff that I
very
think you're
much so.
right, that this is going to stick around. And I don't like necessarily know that SPAs are going to go like the way that Flash went and just kind of disappear. But like,
We can hope.
I mean, the stuff that you're talking about in that quote, that, all these things that quietly happened when and this is like a big talk. Anthony Alaribe, also at Big Sky DevCon, talked about
Yeah,
these myths that
that
people
was
have
great.
about MPAs, which was another, that sort of got me thinking about this and what you're talking about here. It's like, I didn't really notice this performance upgrade either. And this is what's giving me this kind of like, uh, you know, bullish, like just optimism on this way of building. I mean, besides just my own experience where you can sort of see the benefits over time of you build something and then you don't have to touch it that much.
Right. Yeah.
Like that's a big deal. That saves me, I'm a sort of a solo dev, sort of working on different projects and stuff like that. And that just saves me like a ton of time. So when I think about that for other people, that's the sort of thing that makes me really believe in the stuff that you're talking about.
Yeah. Um, one note about Flash, by the way, and I think this kind of speaks to some of the advantages of the web as a place to build, even a place to build a thing like an SPA or a game or whatever, is that Flash is back, actually. You really can't make new games in Flash because there's no Macromedia Flash, but a number of browsers, at least Firefox and Chrome, have a built-in WebAssembly Flash emulator called Ruffle now. And so like 3 years ago, there were a bunch of articles about how much of the web is lost because SWF files can't be played in the browser. Apple famously, quote unquote, killed Flash by not allowing it in the iPhone. And now my mobile phone just has Flash in it. People don't make apps that way anymore, but the fact that it was just on the web and that there's just an asset made it possible, a number of years later to recover that in a way
That's
that's like
cool.
really, really hard for native application, much, much harder for native applications to emulate. So that's kind of neat. Um, and the other thing about, well, okay. So anyway, moving on from Flash, you one of the like early uh, SPA frameworks, if you would. Do you ever build an Angular app?
Yeah, I will say I didn't really get that into Ember or Angular, but I
Yeah.
experimented with both basically.
Yeah, so I've never built an Angular app from scratch, but I did inherit one when I worked at the Washington Post, and the nature of the app that I inherited was that it got built by contractors in the mid 2010s, and then basically was untouched for like a very long period of time. And so it was a little bit of a fossil frozen in amber that missed a huge chunk of web development trends from 2016 to 2022. And that nobody wants to see an Angular app today, right? Like if you look at a code and you see, you go, "Oh God, I have to deal."
What is it?
Sorry to the
NG dash or
yeah, yeah,
something?
yeah. You see NGs everywhere, and you're like, "Wait, where does the?" There's like there's data NGs and there's four there's just like the data model makes no sense to modernize. I'm really sorry to the Angular heads out there, but it's very hard to wrap your head around an existing like Angular 1 application. However, because it is a thing that came out of the trend, because the zeitgeist then was to add attributes to HTML, and there really wasn't a lot of thought that we would be running all the web stuff in JavaScript. JavaScript was still kind of secondary to the actual DOM. There are aspects of that application that enabled it to basically be frozen in time for 7, 8 years, and nobody worried about it. Part of that has to do
Interesting.
also with how Angular is served. So Angular, at that time, just a JavaScript file, like a couple megabytes, I think, but nevertheless, just a JavaScript file that's in your browser. And so nobody's getting security warnings being like your Angular 1 has is a problem now. It's just a file that's in your browser. And HTMX in many ways, I think, is a spiritual successor, if not in application model, but in development model to the way somebody might have built an Angular 1 application. However, and this gets into the library versus framework thing, but far, far less of a conceptual burden because it's really just an extension of HTML.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think about that a lot with just kind of how I mentally separate, the different sort of JavaScript frameworks and libraries and everything. And it's like there's just this massive difference between is this building a virtual DOM and turning your site into everything as a virtual DOM, and like is this just your DOM and it does a few things.
Plus some
And
extra stuff.
yeah, and so because like I mean, I'll tell you that the first way that I sort of came across HTMX and sort of got into it was I was building a very large page. Like so it's a project that I haven't really moved on in a while, but um the idea is basically you're writing something, but it's could be long. You could have the equivalent of like 50, 100 pages worth of writing, but it's all like got, bullet points and tags and stuff like that. So you could sort of picture it. And I was just thinking like, okay, I want this to feel slick. I want it to feel good. And when I tried to do it, I come from the Laravel kind of development background. So I tried to do it in Livewire. I love Livewire. Caleb Porzio, who built Livewire and Alpine, I think is really sharp and like it's sort of a
Yeah,
hypermedia feel. Very good.
definitely.
But Livewire, like a lot of other tools that sort of have to deal with the front end and back end, does put everything into a virtual DOM
Yes,
and has to process everything. And
that's why
so,
I haven't used it.
yeah, and so I was using it and I was like, okay. And then was like, I should stress test this a little bit. Like, I want this application. If you're like writing, some people like to have, Command F and they find the word they're looking for, you know?
Totally.
So I like that. And that's what I'm building. I'm building it for me. Um, so I want to be able to show everything. I was like, I better stress test this and I'll put, 1,000 paragraphs. So I just like ran up a for loop, put 1,000 in there. And all of a sudden it was just dead slow. Like, first of all, it didn't show the page for like, I don't know, 5 seconds or something like that. And then I tried to edit something and it was like, it has to build a virtual DOM out of everything. And that's a huge overload
In JavaScript.
in JavaScript, like JavaScript is not that fast. It's like
No,
it makes you
it's
pause
fine, but
while it thinks. It's
yeah.
like you just want to use it sparingly. So at first I did that, and then I was like, okay, maybe I'll do this with Alpine because it's like that's sort of actually similar, but it's like I was like Livewire might be a little too much. I'll try it with just Alpine. So I did the same thing with Alpine. I was like, man, it's like a little faster, but it's still like we're talking 5 seconds to load the page. So I was like, I'll just get to the HTML and see how slow that is with 1,000. So I go to the HTML and just do that lightning fast. I'm like, okay, this is good. So then I'm reading a little bit about HTMX. I'm like, you know what? Let me see if I just do this with HTMX. And, I just added HTMX at the top. I was like, I don't have to change that much. It's just HTML. And then it's like when I edit it, that's when the HTMX comes in. It's not building a virtual DOM. I don't need to declare anything. It's just like, so I put HTMX, I rewrote the thing with HTMX, and it was within milliseconds of the HTML.
Oh, that's
So,
awesome.
I mean, that was just like, to me, this was like a whole new paradigm and kind of changed the way that is. And so this is like, when I think about tools like this and, in your 100-year web stack, you had those 4 parts, and maybe we can go through those, but HTMX fitting into that because the first one in your web part there was HTML and CSS. Like those are the core for displaying on the web, right?
Yes.
And so okay, so the 4 parts for your thing are like the web, the database, and so why? I mean, I sort of from the talk, my understanding of SQLite is like because it's a single file.
Yeah.
What's the sort of big picture for SQLite as to why that would be the main choice?
So what you're referencing is basically the concept of the talk is if you make an HTML file today and you just put it on a server somewhere, and there are many, many cases of this, it'll last forever. There will always be an HTML file that will render, maybe not identically, but it is robust to the changes in the way that we deploy internet infrastructure. And so the question is, can we take that general robustness and apply it as much as possible to web apps? It'll never be as good really as an HTML file because we just have such great abstractions around the idea of like saving a file for a long period of time, but we can get close, and we want to take those concepts of what's good about the file and get that to something that might be more dynamic, that is more dynamic. So a database back service that you can update and interact with. And the hardest part of that is the database because that's the dynamic bit, right? That's the part where users are going to change what you have, and that's way more dynamic than a file that they can't. So the thing about SQLite, unlike any of the other databases, is that it doesn't require a separate service. It's just a file, it's just a library in your application. And I don't have a technical term to describe this concept, but and maybe that's a thing that I would like to make more academically robust in the future. But basically, what you're trying to do is you're trying to remove as many moving parts from your application as possible. And what is or isn't a moving part is a little bit wishy-washy right now. But I'm confident in saying that that Postgres or MySQL are moving parts. They require orders of magnitudes more active maintenance than running SQLite. SQLite just kind of happens. And one of the big gains of the last 10 years is in both the cost effectiveness of raw computing power, and also SQLite has gotten a lot better and able to take advantage of that. Now, Richard Hipp, the creator of Dr. Richard Hipp, the creator of SQLite, has been saying for years, hey, if you have a website with moderate traffic, you're absolutely fine with SQLite. But people are now it has write ahead log mode and other conveniences that make people believe him a little bit more. And so what that means is that and I said this in the talk, the first thing, if you try to make a web service today and you try to stand it up and you're like, okay, I'm leaving it alone, it's up there forever. Well, the database you set up in one of 2 ways, most likely. Either there's a physical computer somewhere that is likely different than the physical computer that's hosting your website, and you have to, like, I don't know, open the closet and make sure that it's still running and still connected to the internet. Or, much more likely, you paid for a managed hosting service. And eventually that managed hosting service is going to get sick of hosting your outdated version of Postgres because that is not cost effective for them to manage every single version of Postgres that's ever been released indefinitely. And so they will start pushing you to migrate it. And there are these, in application maintenance, there are these cut points and again, this is not a robust concept, but it is one that I think everyone can identify with on some level. There are these cut points where the organization or person or team that is in charge of maintaining an application that has not had to deal with this application anyway is suddenly reminded that it exists, and that if they want it to keep existing, they're going to have to do something. And that is when the boss might say, all right, fine, I will resource this upgrade, or I won't. Or that is when you start calling things tech debt, because this is a thing I no longer want to do, that I have to do, and it's taking away from whatever my current priorities are. So Postgres introduces lots of those. It creates moments where somebody has to do work to keep this thing running. And SQLite introduced, because it's just a file that is co-located with whatever your server is, SQLite never does that. It just keeps working. And that's pretty magical, and I think way more important than people realize.
So this is like, I'll just say, this is like shocking to me when I was watching your talk on this, because, you know, I've been developing and building like pretty big sites for, you know, 15 years or whatever. And I just default to MySQL. Like I just do. And
Many
that's,
people do.
you know, it's like, it's always been fine. And luckily, I think MySQL, I haven't had to deal with a lot of upgrades. I'm always running MySQL on the same server that my website is. Like, so far, that's all been mostly fine.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, I appreciate that about MySQL, I suppose, over some of, I never got into the MongoDB, and I never got into some of these other Postgres and stuff.
I could talk for an hour about MongoDB. I
Yeah.
won't. We can just say you never got into it, and that's fine.
Yeah.
You won.
Yeah. So, but like listening to what you've been saying about SQLite, and I'm just like, it's so obvious. Like that's what I should be using. Like the sites that I work on are not millions of users. I work on niche sites with, you know, maybe hundreds of users at a time, but they're doing like business logic. Like it needs to hit the database. The database needs to be fast.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I need to be able to back it up. And like, what's easier to back up than a single file? Like there's nothing, you know, it's like,
right.
You just can't like, okay, just like run something that copies it every hour or whatever you want to do. Like you just don't, it's not, you know, don't
like
worry about it.
shell commands. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm just like, I'm surprised at myself that like with all the, you know, because I started looking at SQLite, you know, recently in the Laravel world. It's kind of, it's been picked up. There was a couple kind of, there's a big course out right now with Aaron Francis, and I haven't looked into that yet, but it's like when I sort of, now that I'm actually looking at SQLite and I'm like, okay, it's robust. It's running on, you know, what, 4 billion phones right now as we speak. It's like in every single system you can imagine. Yeah. And it basically just works in airplanes. Yeah. It basically just works the same as MySQL, like the queries. Like how different are the queries? I haven't used it enough. Every query I've ever tried in SQLite has worked. Like I don't, maybe there's some difference between MySQL
Sometimes
and
there's
SQLite.
Like a function that you wish was there and it's not. Like they have, everyone's got their own extensions, you know, but for the most part, right.
Yeah. So I'm like, I was just like, I'm like, you know, that's so obvious now that I think about it. Like, why am I not using SQLite by default? And so I feel like that's going to be an easy switch in the next kind of project I work on.
Well, let me know how that goes. And I wouldn't be hard. I mean, we only have so much time in the day to be questioning our default assumptions and familiarities. So again, it's a long, long process.
Well, here's the thing though, like because of the type of work that I do, which is building stuff for people that I am ultimately responsible for. Like it's not getting passed off to anybody else. Yeah. And so I have such an incentive to do what you're talking about, to build something for the long. It's like, you know, if I can build something really good and I'm still, you know, getting paid to maintain it and stuff like that, if I can make that maintenance as easy for myself as possible, and even regardless of whether I'm even getting paid for it, if the maintenance is easy, I'm doing more interesting things. I have more time to experiment with HTMX podcast stuff. You know, it's like my incentive is what you're talking about, to like build systems that are not going to need to be changed. That I'm even a little bit starting to question my Laravel, like some of the Laravel stuff, because you know, every time I go into an old app, I'm like, fuck, should I upgrade this? Like, oh God, should I upgrade this?
That's the cut point. That's the
moment where you're like, do it.
It repels you. You're like, I'm not going to deal with this, so I'm just going to leave it alone.
Well, but okay,
Yeah.
so first of all, HTMX has actually saved me in that world, in that
Oh, tell me
realm.
how.
Well, so this is like 90% of my HTMX use is going into old apps that I thought I can't even bring Livewire into them because I was like, you know what? Most of this sort of fancy front end stuff I do right now is with Live. Like if I build a new feature and I want it to have this kind of feeling of like you change something, you get a
Yeah.
little partial
A
page
tiny
update.
update. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and I do a lot of those, and users really do appreciate having this kind of interactive thing where it reveals stuff as you use it that you need.
Yes, definitely.
So that's what I'm working on it, and my thought before HTMX was like, okay, so to do this on my old apps, of which I have, I don't know, five or something, 5 or 6 that are active and have a lot of users, and they're old. To do this, I'm going to have to upgrade the Laravel version so that I can bring Livewire into it, so that I can start doing these fancy
Huh,
interactive things.
sure.
Instead, I just plop HTMX at the top, and then everything
You're
is
done.
there. All my
Yeah.
stuff, all the everything. I feel like I'm like in a modern development world again, and I'm just like I don't need to ever upgrade this app again because even though it's on Laravel 5.4, that doesn't matter anymore because I don't
Yeah.
need any of the other
And the
requirements.
HTMX version usually doesn't matter. Like I
Yeah.
have live apps that are running on HTMX like 1.8.6 and HTMX is a 2.0 now, and it just doesn't matter. It HTMX 1.8.6 does what I need for the 10 attributes I used or whatever. That's
Yeah.
so much. That's so freeing. It's such a pleasant makes making websites fun again because you don't sign this contract with somebody else or yourself where you're like, now, in 6 months, I will come back to this and figure out which backwards incompatible library upgrades I have to make. It's you're free. You're not doing that anymore.
Yeah. No, exactly. Exactly. Um, and I don't know, when I start recommending HTMX to people, it's like I feel like I shouldn't be able to say this, but I do anyway. I'm just like, you know what? You can just use HTMX. It's gonna work in 10
Yeah,
years. And like
yeah,
I tell people that I don't know, I'm like, why can I say that, about some library that has been around for like a year or two, or maybe it's longer
an
now.
important
And I know
question to
there
ask
was
yourself.
intercooler, and it's like seriously, like, and then I'm like, you know what it is? It's the values of the people behind it. And this is like you talked about this a
Yeah,
little bit in your talk, like the values of Carson, and you are a core maintainer, and there's other people, the people that are involved in this project, similar to the SQLite concept, like
very similar.
it's the reasoning behind it, and the core values, like we are going to make this backwards compatible if we have to do something big at some point. My sense is you guys are going to make it backwards compatible, because that's not even that. I don't even know what you would change, but you're not like, you know what, we need to rename all the attributes, so HMX 3.0 is going to have
Never
like,
going to happen.
we're not using post anymore, like we don't like HX is no longer cool, it's going to be like HTMX, it's a branding thing, that's just not going to happen. So like I recommend it to people, like if you want the long term, then use HTMX. Like
Yeah, there's a couple ways that those values. There's also like a harder. If you want something more than just like I trust these two guys on the internet, or there's a couple of us. It's not just two, but like then one thing you can point to is the loading mechanism, right? So and I also you can download HTMX from a CDN, so you can just like add a link that's like JS deliver or whatever slash HTMX slash version, but the way I always recommend people is just copy the file. Literally make a directory called vendor. This would have been called the vendor pattern, at some point. And put HTMX.js in there, serve it with a year-long cache, and you're done. And that's there's a mindset shift that happens when you do that, which is no longer is this bundle of JavaScript something that I'm dependent on the APIs because there's a whole set of things I have to do to make changes that is not worth the hassle. No, it's just a JavaScript file. And so if there's even if there's a bug, you'll feel a lot more empowered to just edit a JavaScript file that's copied into your project than if it were delivered via NPM. So there's a mindset there, but there's also a more I think robust or a delivery mechanism that encourages ownership in a way that yes, technically you can peg the version, but yeah. The other thing that's true about HTMX, and this is kind of comes back to the cut points thing, but and also very true about HTML, there's never a situation in which to take advantage of new HTML features, you have to move off of old HTML features. That's that the HTML is the most radically backwards compatible probably software delivery mechanism that we have. I think that's I can't think of another one.
Right.
SQLite is really up there, by the way.
Yes, I saw
But
you. It was like
yeah,
2005 was the last like
yeah,
major change. It's
yeah. Isn't that
like
nuts?
that's awesome.
It's awesome.
That is really
And
funny.
why the question that comes to mind when you say, well, why was the last SQLite major version upgrade in 2005? Well, it's got a different development model than most open source projects. And this is kind of an uncomfortable thing to talk about because there's a lot of people that are very committed to the let's call it a democratic method of delivering software, and that has its place. But if you know anything about the SQLite project, they do accept contributions, but like not really. It's very, very hard to contribute anything to SQLite, and there's a handful. There's a foundation, and there's like a handful of people who work on it, and it's been the project basically. It's been spearheaded by one guy its entire lifetime, and it
It's
makes
unreal.
it's unbelievable. Yeah, and it makes different choices that I think are downstream of the organization that is in charge of that software. And those different choices, because in part because this is something that Richard Hip believes, are far, far more backwards compatible. And this I talk about this in the talk. I love their documents page that's like, here's all these mistakes we made in the 2000s, and we're stuck with them now. Here's the config changes that you can make. And I love that. One, because it's funny. They're just like,
Yeah,
we messed up, haha.
and we're not changing that.
And we're not changing it. Yeah. We want it to be compatible with MySQL 3.x or whatever. And that's why you can use double quoted strings. And whoops, that was a horrible decision. First of all, it's kind of cute. But also, it speaks to the just a very different set of values, and that is that I'm a new user of a piece of software exactly once, and that's when I set it up and I make it and I set all the values, I set all the configs, I do whatever it takes to get that thing working, and then for the rest of the lifetime of that piece of software, I am an existing user of all of the libraries that are included in it, and over time, the time that you demand of your existing users is going to be orders of magnitude more than what you demand of your new users. So even though people are like, well, why don't you just change the defaults? Well, because changing the defaults will impose more on the upgrading of my existing users than it will on all my new users. So I think that there's a lot of things that come from that value. You can imagine a benevolent dictator for life who has a different set of values and runs their project completely differently. And that's fine. Like if they're like, I'm going to make a 3.0 and it's going to be completely incompatible with the 2.0, and that's their choice too. So it's not just the governance model that leads to that type of software, but that's a part of what makes that type of software possible.
Yeah, and there's also like a piece of it there's some magic in getting it right such
Yeah,
that you can be that
correct.
backwards compatible. I mean that's like something, if I not that I'm a terrible, I'm a fine programmer, but like there is a sense where like not everybody can hit that home run so that they can then support it and not change it for 20 years after
Yeah,
that.
that's true. That's
Tim
really, really true.
Berners-Lee, like this
Yeah.
guy did it right, and
Hey,
and
yep.
the SQLite guy, it's like, and in my
And Carson
opinion,
did with
Carson Gross.
HTMX.
Yeah, exactly.
And I don't know, I've never actually talked to Carson about this, but I wonder what made him, because he talks about HTMX as an intercooler 2.0. And on the intercooler website, it's like, hey, there's intercooler will be supported indefinitely, but if you want to move to HTMX, then you can, and here it is. And there's something kind of important about that is hard to pin down. Like there was no Intercooler had users. If you look the Hacker News comments of HTMX, every so often somebody pops up and is like, "I'm a very happy Intercooler user of 10 years. Thank you for making such a nice little library." So Carson very easily could have said, "I have this existing brand name. I'm gonna use," and that's what the vast majority of open source software developers do. They say, "I have this brand name, and I'm going to protect that brand name." And and iterate on it in the way that I want to because my initial choices are confining. And there's a social magic in saying this is a new thing, and I will support the old thing, but this is a new thing, and because I have already done the old thing before. I mean, HTMX is a removal of the intercooler or the jQuery dependency from intercooler, but much more importantly, HTMX is a better interface than intercooler, and that's the key. Is that HX get, HX post, HX delete, the swaps. And by the way, I think the swap default is wrong. Like the default swap is inner HTML, and I often end up changing that to outer
It's
HTML. I think
almost
that
always outer.
it's almost always outer. Yeah, um, yeah, and I think we go back and forth on this, but I have never advocated that we change that default, even though I think it's wrong. I think it is a bad default. Because when you make the app and you want an outer swap and you get an inner swap, the first time you do it, you're like, crap, should have been an outer swap. So, um, but nevertheless, the options in there, inner, outer, before, begin, before end. Like, first of all, they draw on the language of the HTML standard, which is important. The JavaScript APIs for adding new elements also use before, begin, after, end. They use that language. That was very smart. Um, but just that is for the majority use case of what people want to do with this kind of software, which is extend HTML with partial page replacements and make use of the full set of methods and maybe more advanced stuff than that. But that is what HTMX is optimized for, and that interface is really, really powerful at getting that done really, really simply. And I think that I'm excited to see that inspire lots of new people and do different things with hypermedia concepts and the HTML parser in the browser and so on. But that core idea, that limitation inherent in that interface, that you're mostly going to be swapping in and out partial DOM replacements with HTTP methods, that was the right one, and that's why it can be the kind of project that you described.
Yeah, and I mean, I've never used intercooler, so I can't
Me neither.
really compare them. But I mean, I just think maybe this is just kind of one of those like you strike light. But I mean, HTMX is just such a perfect
It's a great
like
name, isn't it?
branding
Yeah.
for an extension of HTML. Like it's just like it's so immediately you get like, oh, okay, it's not quite HTML, but like it's something a little different, a little more, but it's rooted in HTML. So like whatever I know he said he had some other name that was like a swear
Right.
word in
That's
Danish or something,
Norwegian or
or like,
something. Yeah.
yeah. So like whatever that was, like it just wouldn't have captured. And so like, there's some, however that comes up, sometimes it's just luck. Sometimes you just have a good idea. But I mean, I just feel like that it so perfectly encapsulates what it
Yeah.
is that it's just like, that's, you can't do better than that for branding.
There's an
So,
amazing alchemy to that, and there's a hoary cliche about something about luck being a function of preparation or whatever.
right.
You can see that in a lot of Carson's work. First of all, HTMX, great name, great branding. He's very funny online. So all of that combines with the fact that he'd been doing JavaScript libraries for partial DOM replacement for 10 years. I mean, that's not insignificant, right? Those things combine. And even if you had all those ingredients, you might not be able to make them combine. And the timing was right, by the way. I mean, if you'd done HTMX 1.0 was released in like 2020 or 2021 or something like that. And if you had, as evidenced by similar projects from the late 2010s that didn't take off, the timing was wrong. So timing's a big part of it. But also you can see that in the writings too. I mean, a big part of the themes in the first talk and about the life and death of HTMX, but also in the second one where I'm talking about building web services for a long time, is that is the grammar of REST, right? Is reclaiming REST as a useful way of describing a particular architecture for online services. And if you read, all of Carson's tweets and he's like going off about REST in like a particularly deranged way, and he's using the AI art and he's, in all caps. One time he's like, hey, I woke up and I had a manic break today. I'm sorry. Like, that you look at that and you're like, that's a very funny person, but then you go read the essays on the website and you realize that there's a very deep, rock solid intellectual core to the arguments he's making. And even if it's going to be 10 years before anybody uses the phrase REST correctly again, and you're going to be wading through millions of comments. They're like, who cares? It's over. It means this now, blah, 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 blah. It's like, no, that there is value in being able to accurately, academically, and precisely describe an architecture, and all of the memes just create a funnel for you to look at the very real, very well thought out philosophy that underlies it.
No, I mean, and even, I came to it through Grug Brain, and it's
Yeah, I
like,
did too, actually.
if it was just the Grug Brain essay and nothing else, like
Yeah.
I still would have tried. I would have tried whatever was on the website. Like I'm like, the Grug Brain stuff is a lot of experience distilled into something that is
Correct.
like very
A lot
funny.
of people miss that.
So yeah, I mean that's like a lifetime of software development. Like
Yeah,
my
frustrations.
all the different companies I've worked for. Like I'm like, okay, yeah, this is
Yeah, that really resonated with me too. And I saw at the bottom of the Greg Brain, he said something about how he now has some modest open source success. And I was like, oh, it's the HTMX guy. I've been reading him. Let me check that out for real. So yeah.
nice. So one of the things that like keeps one of the things you mentioned in the 4 things for the 100 years is this idea of the routes file.
Yeah.
And I think of this as like part of what you're sort of saying with like bringing REST back as like a central way of talking about your web application.
Correct.
So, I love the routes file. Laravel has that, something that they have sort of argued, different places have kind of argued,
yeah.
like, oh, we don't need, like, this is so weird to have this just like one file where you like just declare all these like random route. Like it just, I feel like people are moving away from that a little bit. But to me, that's always like, that's my rock for a Laravel application.
It's your entry point. It's your it's your starting point.
Exactly. Like I go there and I can see everything that the app does, with the exception of, there's a bunch of these kind of third-party plugins now that go into the vendor folder. And so you don't necessarily see them in the routes. And that's actually a problem sometimes.
It's a huge problem. You're like, where'd that come from?
Yeah, like I have no idea. And then they have other ways to look at the routes, but my favorite is just to go to the routes file. So like, I think that's good. But and this is like, maybe under the classification of like just something where I feel like maybe this is the academic or intellectual side, but I don't get, and I feel a little like I should, but this happened at the talk too. And the Triptych stuff.
Yeah.
Like, what does it matter? Put and patch, like really, because I've been developing for 15 years, making these sites, and I just use Post. And I'll just make my case first.
Please.
Like Post is like, I just think of it as like, I'm changing something. I don't know if I'm changing something to add. I don't know if I'm updating something, editing something, like whatever it is. It's like, to change something, you need some sort of extra permissions. And like when I do a GET request, maybe I need an auth, but Post is like, your server is going to block things that try to access this route, if you haven't sent a Post request. And so you need to do, this is just the way I think about it.
Yeah.
I need to send a Post request to do something that's going to change something on the back end. And I don't necessarily,
yes.
Yeah. So delete, put, patch. I've never thought about it because I've never needed to think about it. I looked it up after seeing your talk. And I'm like, okay, they're adding these, like, then I'm just like, yeah, but does it matter? And also, like, is it really, if you had a put and a patch and you knew what they meant, is it always that simple? I guess like sometimes I feel like when you're editing, maybe you're updating, maybe you're creating, and maybe you don't know until you get to the application logic, and that's where you make your decision about what's being changed. So I don't know, what's the case for put and patch and delete, like needing their own thing besides a Post?
Sure. Let me ask real quick before I answer that. When you have access to put and delete in HTMX, do you use them?
I've used delete just because I just like that clarity.
Right. And you're deleting the thing at the URL, which is nice.
Yeah, exactly. And Laravel has a nice, Laravel accepts in the routes, you can put like route delete. Yeah. So, like it's all there. And so I get So yes, I have used deletes, and I don't always, but yeah, I usually do now
Right.
because I'm using the HTMX.
So you referenced Triptych. Triptych is what came out of the first talk, which is three proposals that I think take the core of what's useful and interesting about HTMX and add them to HTML. And
Okay,
they
wait,
those
wait.
yeah.
Sorry. What's the name triptych? What's that? I get the try part. There's three, but
Yeah,
like,
so
what's
a
the?
triptych in art is a set of three panels. It typically they're religious imagery, and so the center panel has two panels on the side, and they sometimes fold together, and you see them in altarpieces and stuff like that. And so there are three images, and the three images all interrelate in some way, usually to create a larger picture. So
Love it.
that's where
Love
the
it.
name comes from. Yeah. Um, so yeah, it's three HTML proposals that interrelate to create a lot. That altogether, I think if these things existed in HTML, it would be a dramatic leap forward in the ability to create websites that have no JavaScript at all, and B are like way further along in this durable architecture that I talk about in the second talk. So if you can start creating applications that are whose functionality is entirely described in the HTML, entirely in the hypermedia, then you return to something that is very, very close to the static site maintenance experience. And that's all, those two concepts are tied together. I think the more that you can the academic term for this would be the self-describing nature of a web service, like the extent to which that self-description fits entirely in HTML. There's just like there are a number of web services that I maintain right now that use HTMX that if Triptych were implemented, I wouldn't need HTMX at all. I would just be super happy with hard page loads and so the three proposals are: one, put, patch, and delete support for HTML forms; two, buttons should be able to make requests without being wrapped in a form, which is entirely that actually doesn't even add new functionality, but it's very, very important syntactic sugar for making a document interactive.
Hmm.
And it's much more useful with the first one with additional methods, because you can do things like model a logout button. There's no if you've ever had that moment where you're like, how am
Which
I
like
supposed to
every
do a
single
logout
website
button?
I've ever done, I'm like,
Yes,
do I just do like a get for logout? Which is what I
right.
usually do. It's weird.
Yeah, and a get, by the way, is bad because a lot of browsers will prefetch. So there's a bunch of Stack Overflow and they'll only prefetch get requests because, in theory,
That's
when
funny. I didn't
the
think about
developer
that.
using the get request knows that it won't have any side effects on the server. So I'm previewing what I'm going to say is important about methods in a moment, but not the fact that there are use cases in the web that are as common as a logout button, which again is on every single website you go
Yeah.
to, that don't have an obvious way to model them within the existing semantics of HTML is evidence of a lack, is evidence of something that's missing there. So, and then the third one is partial page replacement. And I don't even think partial page replacement is like tremendously important. I think it's valuable, but going back to it is valuable, and people will continue to reach for JavaScript if they don't have it. So that's a big part of why it's there. But there are, even if I just had the first two, there's a lot of things I'd start building without HTMX at all. But partial page replacement, very good, and we will get there. So the first one, by the way, we have already worked with the standards body. There's some updates that need to be made to the proposal I'm working on right now, and there is interest from browser makers, which is very exciting. That is not, I think, the median experience of people who want to make changes to HTML. So that's really cool that they are working with us on that. We're very excited about it. But to
How
answer
did
yeah, go for it.
well, how did that, I mean, then maybe that's a whole separate story, but
Yeah, let me
I don't even know.
answer your question, and then I'll
Yeah, yeah.
explain. We'll talk a little more about that. So why is it important to describe the web application in roots and methods and kind of this basic semantics of the web platform? And there's kind of like a practical reason for it. I think the practical reasons are much easier to explain. If you like having stuff in your roots file, then it gives you a very useful grammar to be able to not go so far deep into what the root what the URL of the root has to explain. So if I use like a reservation, like a hotel reservation site as an example a lot, because it's a very generic paradigm that you could imagine applying to like basically anything. It's like I'm making something, and it's quote unquote CRUD. It's create, read, update, delete. So if I make a reservation and I post so you post a new form and you say, hey, I want to save this, I want to reserve this hotel room for 2 nights on these dates. And the server does it, and it responds with a URL that is the URL of your reservation. So it might be at like /reservations/ 123. And then I'm now viewing that reservation. So that every time I go to /reservation/123, I can see the status of it and the upcoming and the details and all that. Now, as a web developer, I have to decide, how do I want to let people interact with this reservation? How do I want to let them update it in some way? And the easiest, simplest thing to do is an update is a put. You just put at /reservation/123. And already I have moved a lot of logic that would have happened in the application to the root, because I no longer, the part where I figure out what reservation I'm acting on now happens in the router, because what comes after /reservations is some ID, and the router will extract that ID from the URL. So the URL describes a resource. It stands for Uniform Resource Locator. And it describes a resource, and all of the methods describe different actions that the user can take on that resource. So a put is an update. A delete is a delete. And a patch might be a partial update. Now, you absolutely could use post instead of put to do an update. So the pattern would be you post to /reservations, and then you get a /reservations/123, and maybe you want to post to that 123 as well, and that's fine.
Yeah, that's what
That'd
I
be totally
usually
fine.
do.
Most people do that, and that's okay. But first of all, you can't even do delete, and the delete one is really obvious. Like that's a thing where I should
Yeah.
be able to delete. So even just having delete is a really big deal. And once you have delete, from the browser's perspective, all that's supported right now is post. So you have to make some pretty substantial changes to the navigation spec in order to genericize that. But if you're already genericizing it, well, just give us put. And put is nice also because, and by the way, this is all in the Triptych proposal. So there's a section 8, I think, has all of the practical examples where I talk about how this makes the life of application developers easier. Um, but if you have put, you can have a different, routers often, like in Express, let you do permissions as well. And I think that's like a really nice, really auditable way to do permissions. Like a random unlogged in user shouldn't be able to delete your reservation. And frankly, logged in users that aren't you shouldn't be able to delete your reservation. So
Right.
when you're doing permissions in the router, you also have access to like a really reusable but still very granular mechanism. But once I'm describing the whole life cycle as method X on resource Y, as opposed to what you have to do now to work around, like say do something like /123/delete, or there are limitations to all those workarounds. But when I have access to that full lifecycle set of methods on a resource, then I can preserve the usefulness, the utility of that router file across a larger variety of behavior, because there aren't things that I have to then kick out to the imperative logic of the application for. So I can model in a way that preserves that scannability, that like here's my entry point to the application. Here really is all the things the application can do. This is every way somebody can interact with my application. And here are all the branching. I'm putting a ton of the branching logic into the description of the application itself. And that kind of like transitions into the headier philosophical concepts, which I don't even think Carson and I have totally nailed down yet. Like I sent him a message once when we were writing this thing. I was like, what? Why are methods essential to the uniform resource description? And I believe that they are, but I think, and this is cited in the proposal, but I think that a lot of the existing literature on this is very contradictory. I think Fielding contradicts himself a bunch on this question, but I think they are, and I think that the next step, once this stuff is in use, is to take that and put it in like an academically precise way, so that people can keep building on their understanding, the human body of knowledge of understanding of what the web is. But for the time being, I can just point to, I'm an application developer. here are very, very obvious, very, very common paradigms that this makes much, much simpler. And we need to build this functionality into the HTML. And it's already in the platform. It's reserved for JavaScript, which is, again, a thing that I think that causes a lot of the decay over time is functionality that is stuck in JavaScript.
Yeah, I mean, so I think something that like I think you guys both are, just in general, HTMX, there's this link to academia and to academia, but also maybe not academia is maybe not the right word, but
No, it is
like
definitely the right word.
is
Yeah.
it? Okay, yeah. I mean, so this link to like, and this is something that's like, so you don't work in for like in the university type thing, right? Is that
Technically,
correct?
I am affiliated with Dartmouth College because my very first, well, I went to Dartmouth, and the
Okay.
very first application that I built using these principles was like my test run was to completely rebuild an application that somebody had built for them in React. I've referenced it actually in both talks, but completely rebuild it, and I'm still trying to figure out what the best way to tell the story completely is. But with that had React, MongoDB, and two repos.
The
It was like a
trifecta.
yeah, yeah. It's exactly the zeitgeist of 2018.
All right.
It cost hundreds of dollars a month to run. It had a ton of issues. And I was like, I've been reading about SQLite and I've been reading about HTMX. And I think if I put these two together, I can make a thing that lasts a really long time. And that was a smashing success. In that, like, that is a functioning web application that is serving really active traffic that I don't have to maintain in any active way at all. Occasionally there's like a new feature or something they want and I make time for it. But I really don't have to think about this thing kind of ever. And it is doing, a couple thousand requests a day with active database transitions. So, but no, I'm not like a master's or PhD student or anything. I have a BA.
Okay. Yeah. So, but like, there's this sort of academic, and maybe this is what I'm kind of wondering is like, how is it that link, the academia link, that gets it into like actually changing HTML? Like, what's that connection? Like, how do you even
No,
get
not at
started
all.
asking about that stuff? Like,
Actually, yeah, it's a great question. Um, that they seem like they would be the same thing, right? They seem like they would be related. Like having some. Carson is the creator of HTMX is an MSU Montana State University, yeah, Montana State professor. Um, and so obviously he is an academic and he's pursuing a PhD at the moment. But that's totally separate from how you get stuff into the web as a platform. And these are these cons. I think that studying the early history of the web, and that's by the way something I'm pretty deficient in. I think there's a lot more that I could learn about how this stuff happened. But um, there's a ton of tension between the this is true of any field anywhere, but between the academic purity of the self-describing hypermedia system and the practice of it. A very obvious example of this is like, and this goes back to your point earlier about Tim Berners-Lee, like getting this basically perfect interface. Well, and I apologize if my history is wrong, but I'm pretty confident that Tim Berners-Lee was on the committee that really wanted to move to an XML based HTML. So like XHTML, there's a big push for that, and that push ultimately failed and led to the formation of the Web Hypertext Application Technologies Working Group, which is like related to the World Wide Web Commission, but it isn't. But they're like, it created a splinter body that was like your concerns about what would be like these do not reflect the reality of using HTML. So HTML5 ultimately sort of won the battle between the XHTML and HTML5 people. So there's always tension there, and there's a ton of tension in the fact that HTML has patterns that can lead to security. Like there are problems with the default ideas of HTML that we now have to patch in an additive way because we really, I don't know if marquee still works, but for the most part, we like mostly don't take things out of HTML because we don't want to break the web. So I think that and I'll talk about the practical, how you get stuff into the web platform in a second, and with the caveat that I have not done so successfully yet. But the purpose of the academic stuff, I think, and I think that I don't want to say it's undervalued by software practitioners, but I would say that people tend to dismiss terms like REST or the attempt to describe these things at a academically rigorous level because they're like, well, I need to make something work. And today I'm going to go to work and I'm going to get paid and I'm going to make something useful. And that's fine. That's a totally fine attitude to have. The value of um, describing Triptych, describing HTML, describing my proposals at a really eggheady level is that it lets you see things that you wouldn't otherwise see. If you did not first define the language that lets you talk about them usefully. So part of why it's so important that Carson started ranting about how REST requires hypermedia was that Carson read a lot of Roy Fielding stuff where Roy Fielding says a REST API isn't just about using post and get correctly. It has to be hypermedia based. It has to be self-describing. So the API needs to return some HTML and that needs to display to the user's browser. And that is crucial to REST. Um, if you're not willing to engage in the discussion about what REST is, then you can't even fathom that possibility because you don't have the language to do so. So it's important because it sharpens your ability to then take the case for why your ideas should be adopted into HTML and describe them really efficiently because you have already worked on doing so in a less practical realm. So then you have the ability to take that, be like, this is exactly what's useful about this. This is why I have the language and the citations to answer all of your practical concerns.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating because it feels like there's such a like strong foundation or base for so I read the hypermedia systems book and it's just like it when I sort of work on other pieces of technology and kind of learn about them, it's very things are practical based. It's based in like here's what you can do with it. There isn't much of a need to go into the deep part of it. So I think it felt very novel and it feels very different to have this kind of wealth of actual academic essays. There's
Mm-hmm.
papers about hypermedia stuff. Like this is a realm that I've never gotten into, probably would have no reason to ever get
Yeah.
into in any realistic way. But I really appreciate the thought that has gone into it. And the fact that, you know, members of the HTMX team and just people involved in the project are thinking about those sort of things, thinking about this like bigger picture of the web. And I think
Yeah.
that gives such an advantage to all of this stuff. It's like it's so cohesive.
Absolutely. And even if you don't care about the academic stuff, you pick up on the cohesion. And that counts for something. It makes the ideas better and it gives you the feeling like, hey, these people care. They're trying and they want to make a difference. And that's true. Everybody involved does so. There's really no money associated with it. Does so because they really believe it's the right way to move forward. Um, I didn't answer your other question about the process of getting something into the HTML spec, and it's not really that mysterious. There are public meetings that happen all the time, and there's a public spec for all the web browser standards. So there's just like a process, and you can go on their website and read about how to make a WATWIG issue or how to make a PR request. And the fact that Carson has been in touch with browser engineers because of the success of HTMX, and they've inquired. They're like, what about HTMX should be included in the browser? So
Wow.
one of the things that I was able to do this past summer was take those basically like follow up on that thread. Okay, well let's try and think about, given the constraints of the web platform, what could be included. And that the academic stuff we're talking about earlier, that matters insofar as it gives me a sense of like why, but that really, all that stuff is kind of downstream of me just like looking at the existing web APIs in HTML and going, okay, how can we fit this in here? It's really easy for methods because there's a method element on the form. So the method element should just support more methods. That's not a
And
hard
it's
one.
not changing anything, you know,
No,
it's just, it's additive, purely additive.
purely additive. So that one's, from an API standpoint, very easy. Partial page replacement is going to be a lot more difficult.
Right.
But that's okay. We're going one by one. And yeah, so we got a bit of a boost there. And so I would say that if you have something you want to get into the HTML standard, attach it to a very popular web library, and maybe you'll get a little more attention. But at the end of the day, like we did the same thing that everybody else has to do, which is write it down in excruciating detail, and then that's what Triptych is and is becoming. And then show up at a meeting and be like, "Here's my detailed idea," and be prepared to answer questions about
That's awesome. I mean, that's, yeah, just the possibility of having that sort of change, you know, making an actual change to something so fundamental is just kind of exciting
it.
to
Yeah,
witness. I'm excited for you.
if I
That's
accomplish
cool. It's
nothing
very cool.
else in my life, and I am was a part of putting something in the HTML standard, I mean, that's gonna kill at parties. Hey, you ever used a put form? That's me, baby. I did that. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're at about an hour 15. So I want to be I really appreciate your time coming on and talk. Is there anything you want to like plug or anything like that, or just kind of mention
No,
that we
not
didn't
not
cover?
really. Super fun conversation. I would say that if anything we talked about here was interesting to you, or you were frustrated that we didn't explain some background, I apologize for that. And check out my website, alexanderpetros.com. The Triptych proposals that we mentioned are at alexanderpetros.com/triptych. There are two talks that I've given recently that we referenced a fair amount. One of them is called The Life and Death of HTMX from Big Sky DevCon. The other one is called Building the 100-Year Web Service. That was at Utah JS. And all three of those things together are part of the larger project that I'm trying to pursue to make HTML better for developers and ultimately make the web better for everyone. If you're interested, find me, be in touch. That's what I'm working on.
Nice. And I will try to include every one of those links you just mentioned
Awesome.
in the show notes right at the top.
And I
Yeah.
have a blog also called unplannedobsolescence.com, in which I talk about a lot of these topics, and also kind of like it includes practical tips for how to build web applications for HTML.
Nice. Excellent. There's a
Yeah,
good
Lazarus,
10,000.
really. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, there's a good 10,000 Maniacs song called Planned Obsolescence you should
I
check out.
will definitely check that out. Yeah, and I love the conversation. I had a great time coming on, and I think this podcast is super cool. So I hope you stick with it.
Awesome. No, I'm having a great time. This was really good. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you talking.
My pleasure.
So,
Have a good one.
all right, you too. Bye.
Bye.